So hello, everyone, and welcome tonight to our program Supporting Your Trans or Non-Binary Child with Lotus Đỗ, who is a therapist and gender dysphoria specialist and consultant. I am Shireen Ash. I'm a librarian at the Corte Madera Library, and I'm really pleased to present this program. We're doing a series of programs or a number of programs in celebration of Pride Month. And I think this is a really important program to offer to our community, and I'm very grateful to Lotus for agreeing to speak with us. So a little bit about tonight. We are recording the program. It will be available later. Programs are usually available within 2 weeks of the scheduled date and will be on our website and on our YouTube channel, so we can refer to it again. In addition, I would just ask that you stay muted throughout the program, and questions can go in the chat. I will read them out at the end. And midway, Lotus is going to have a break midway as well for questions. And I also really want to thank the friends of the Corte Madera Library for their generous support of this program. So with that, I will disappear and see you when it's time for questions. And Lotus, take it away.
Great, thanks so much. And thanks everyone for joining this evening. Again, my name is Lotus. I use he, him, his pronouns, and we'll go ahead and get started. And so I have a pretty ambitious agenda for this evening, but we will make sure to pause for questions, especially at the midpoint and also at the end, because it's such an amazing opportunity to have a virtual space together where we're coming together with the priority of supporting our kids, children in our life, trans and non-binary youth in general. And so I really invite you all to participate as much as you're able and comfortable doing so. And also keep in mind that this is recorded. And so if you will be sharing questions, I would also advise to not use names. We don't want anything with identifying information either. So just a little note on that. And so a little quick bio for me. Again, my name is Lotus. I've been working as a therapist for almost a decade. I know I look very young, one of the magics of testosterone. And so I've actually worked specifically in the Bay Area for most of my career. And I've worked in public health settings, trauma hospitals, urgent care, and I've only more recently started working in private practice because I noticed that there was a high need for therapists. And so I went ahead and posted my website in the chat, and I really encourage you to take a look at the resource page. These are the resources that I share with the people that I work with, the families that I work with, because in my experience, although things can be really hard, things actually do get better over time with the adequate support. And so again, just want to thank you all for being here, and we'll go ahead and get started. And so just to make sure that we're all on the same page here, I'll be using a few words, referencing a few concepts, as language is such a beautiful thing. It's constantly evolving. And I've learned, and I've been very humbled by working with trans and non-binary youth, that especially when it comes to coming up with words to describe their experiences, there's constantly new words and concepts. And so I myself am always learning. I am a lifelong learner. And for those who are maybe new to supporting, maybe your kiddo recently disclosed their gender identity to you, you're not really too sure what some of the acronyms or the words are. It's Pride Month this month, and so you've probably seen LGBTQIA. And so here's the progress flag. It's a more updated, more recent version of the traditional Pride flag that actually includes the transgender colors, the intersex colors. But the acronym actually stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer and questioning, intersex, asexual, and agender. And so we'll break that all down a little bit more. But again, when it comes to working and supporting your trans or non-binary young person, most likely, especially with social media, a lot more visibility and representation in the media as well, and just the general public, most likely they're going to be using these words and also coming up with new words over time. And so an important distinction that I like to make, especially when talking to parents and providers as well, is that it's a really important nuance between gender expansive and transgender or non-binary. And so the concept of gender expansive was actually created by a mental health provider from the Bay Area who worked specifically with trans and non-binary youth. And the way that we would describe someone or a young person who is gender expansive is when their expression, whether it's the clothes they wear, the things they prefer, the toys they prefer, the way that they speak or maybe do their hair, is considered non-conforming to social and cultural standards. And so, really old school example would be, a boy who likes to play with dolls. And so in some ways that would be considered gender non-conforming. And the difference between a gender expansive child or a young person and a transgender or non-binary young person is that gender expansive kids don't necessarily have any gender specific stress, except maybe if they're getting bullied at school for their behavior. And so, these kids are actually exploring who they are, exploring things that they may or may not like. It's actually very normal and expected for just typical childhood development. When you're young and developing, you're trying on different things, figuring out if it works for you or not. And so there is a certain level of gender exploration that does happen during children and adolescents, especially around with puberty as well. And that's all perfectly fine. There's nothing inherently wrong with it, nothing that needs to be fixed about it. And so the only gender specific stress that gender expansive kiddos might experience is actually from bullying, because their behavior is seen as not normal. And unfortunately, sometimes that bullying even comes from parents and family members. And so when it comes to trans and non-binary kids, sort of the more hallmark experience and challenge is that these kids actually have gender dysphoria. And so there is a certain sense of distress in the body, distress around how people perceive you as not who you know you are. And so sometimes there's actually a need for gender-related transition. And so I wanted to start with this concept of naming the nuances between gender expansive kids and trans and non-binary kids. Because if you're a parent, if you're an adult that's here and you have young people in your life, or maybe your child is, gender non-conforming to our society's standards, doesn't necessarily mean that they're trans or non-binary. And that's an important thing to name. When I used to work at SF General in the hospital, I would often get phone calls from providers that would say, we have a kid here who is transgender and needs to see you. But when I actually meet with the kid isn't transgender, doesn't identify that way, maybe just wants to wear certain clothes that their parents consider non-conforming. And so really be mindful about, placing an identity on your kid's experience that may actually not be there. The safest thing is to actually just ask and let the young person or your kid actually share with you and disclose with you who they are. But as adults, as parents, as providers, we want to really welcome and celebrate gender diversity, whether that's with identity or presentation. And so for the rest of this presentation, we're going to focus, or I'm going to focus specifically on how to support trans and non-binary kids. And so I'm not going to talk too much about gender expansive kids who don't have gender dysphoria. They could be perfectly happy with, being a boy that likes to wear a dress, or a girl that wants to play, with action figures. I'm not really going to be talking about those kids at all. I'm going to be focusing on what you can do as a parent or as an adult when you have someone in your life, or maybe your child, who's actually having a really hard time. And so when I do talk about the kids in our lives, as I've shared, language is constantly evolving. We have what we consider sort of an umbrella for trans and non-binary experience, where some of the binary experiences includes trans woman, trans girl, trans man, trans boy, maybe even just boy or just girl that happens to be trans. And then you also have experiences and concepts like non-binary, genderqueer, gender fluid. The list goes on and on. And again, the safest bet is to always just ask, don't assume, and also be okay with things changing and evolving over time. Because as we also know, during adolescence and teenage years, exploration is completely normal. Doesn't mean that the young person isn't trans or non-binary. It just might mean that they're still figuring out where on that spectrum, where under the umbrella feels the most right for them. And so for folks who are newer to some of these terminology and concepts, I really like this infographic because it was actually created by trans and non-binary kids. It was created by Trans Student Educational Resources. They have a lot of really fun infographics that I think are great for everyone of all ages, really easy to understand, but breaks down these different concepts that hopefully help explain, can help people, including adults and parents, better understand what trans kids and non-binary kids are experiencing. And so I'll use myself as an example here. If I were to sort of fill out this infographic around, gender and sex, I would say that for me, my gender identity is that I would fall somewhere around male or man. My gender expression is typically more masculine, and I was assigned female at birth. And so, that's one way that you can sort of actually exercise for yourself. Where do you fall when it comes to the beautiful diversity of the human experience of various identities? And things can change over time. If you had asked me maybe 10 years ago how to fill out this chart, I actually didn't know that I was trans about 10 years ago. And so I probably would have put female, feminine, female straight down the board until I was actually a little bit more aware of who I was and my trajectory in life. But this is a great infographic, and I love using this with kids as well that I'm working with, especially if they're earlier on in understanding who they are. Then we would revisit this pretty regularly, and encourage and really normalize that exploration is okay. And it's actually a healthy part of human development. And then finally, to wrap up, terminology and concepts, we have to talk about pronouns. And so again, this is from Trans Student Educational Resources. I love their infographics. And what I really like about their infographics is that when they talk about pronouns, they also include ways to use the pronouns, and they include all gender pronouns and neopronouns like Z, here, zers, newer created neopronouns that mostly trans youth and non-binary youth have created because they didn't really feel like she or he or even they was adequately fitting their gender identity. And so it gives really concrete examples of how do you apply using respectful, affirming pronouns in sentences when talking about your child or your young person in your family or young person at work. And so it's a great resource. I also hand this out often to parents and adults that I'm working with just to give some more concrete guidance around how to be affirming and respectful. And so now that we have sort of a shared language, a shared understanding around the concepts that I'll be covering tonight, I want to take a moment to actually name the context that our young trans people and non-binary kids are living in right now. And so there was a recent study in the past few years. It was actually the largest study of trans and non-binary Americans to date, where it's thousands and thousands of survey participants. And to date, it's the most accurate and largest survey of trans and non-binary folks in the United States. And so what was revealed, and in many ways confirmed to people who already knew this as their lived experience, I really want to highlight that 78% of participants reported harassment during grade school. That is a ridiculously high amount of people being harassed during really key developmental stages of their life, when you're really supposed to be receiving, attached, like secure attachment with adults, building relationships with your peers that are healthy and safe. But if you're experiencing harassment, whether it's bullying, people teasing you for being who you are, refusing to use your pronouns, not letting you use spaces that feel safe and affirming for you, then, no wonder that so many of the young people we have are struggling right now. Half of participants also reported needing to educate their medical providers, whether that be a primary care provider, how to use the right name and pronouns, and if they get older, having to educate their providers around how to be respectful, or even give them what they need around their reproductive health. And almost half of the participants couldn't afford medical care. And so really focusing here on, the trans and non-binary young people in our life, in our families and communities, is that also an alarmingly high number of participants reported being physically assaulted during grade school. And so it's no surprise that almost 20% ended up leaving school, and almost 30% postponed medical care, not specifically gender affirming care, but primary care. It could be something like preventative care, whether it's STI screenings, cancer screenings, things like that, that most people, everyone actually should be doing, but really postponing it out of fear of having a negative experience or even a harmful experience. And so the reason that I'm highlighting all of this data is that it's all happening in this country, and it's also still happening. This survey was many years ago, but as some of you may know, over the last few years, there's actually been more and more legislation that is targeting trans youth, whether it's, completely outlawing, making illegal gender affirming care in Arkansas, or forcing people to disclose their gender identity, even if it risks their safety, and preventing people to actually participate in hobbies and leisurely activities like sports. And so it's still happening. It's most likely going to continue happening. And so I think it's really important that when we're talking about how do we support our trans and non-binary kids, the young people in our life, because social media is such a norm nowadays, so many kids are on TikTok, it's all of these things happen. And I can share, unfortunately, that in the typical week when I'm working with young people, at least one young person will bring up, well, I saw that law that's trying to get passed. I'm not really I don't really want anyone to know that I'm trans, because there's this general cultural of fear right now. And so as an adult and as a parent, in many ways, we have to create extra cushion and extra space for that sense of fear, and that real sense of you're not supposed to be here. And so, when we're coming together as adults, as parents and as providers, we need to keep an awareness around the culture that we're in, the laws that are trying to get passed, the laws that are passing, and also know that, the kids are most likely seeing it too. They may not bring it up, but it's probably been shared on TikTok. Someone probably talked about it at school. And these sort of news headlines also feed into biases and people's inherent biases as well. And so now we're going to shift into, what the heck is gender dysphoria? So we hear this term a lot when talking about folks who are trans or non-binary. And most of the time when I ask someone, well, what is gender dysphoria? The most common response I get is, it's when your insides don't match your outsides, or, your body is not what it's supposed to be. And I'd actually like to expand on that, because for me, there's an important distinction between gender dysphoria as a diagnosis, so capital G, capital D, and that's something that someone that's a mental health provider like myself, or a medical provider like a doctor or endocrinologist, we've been trained to basically assess an individual, a young person, and there's criteria that specifically children and adolescents have to meet in order to be diagnosed with gender dysphoria. So that's sort of one part of gender dysphoria, is the diagnosis of it, the very clinical aspect of gender dysphoria. That's more along the lines of, my body isn't what it's supposed to be. My gender identity doesn't match my body. And for me, as a mental health provider, and also as a trans person, I know that gender dysphoria is much more complex as an experience. And so for some people, they may not actually meet the criteria for gender dysphoria, but it doesn't mean that they don't need support around their gender identity. And so what I would like to offer for folks who are attending is that it's so rare when I work with a young person who will say, I have gender dysphoria, or I'm feeling dysphoric today. I would say that it's happening more and more, where maybe 2-3 years ago when I was working with young people, very rarely would I hear young people self-identify as having gender dysphoria. I'm actually hearing it a little bit more nowadays because I think there's more education and awareness around the clinical terms. But what is a lot more common for me is actually hearing sort of indirect ways of describing suffering and describing pain that's associated with the body and with the gender identity and the gender expression. And so I would invite you all to think and approach gender dysphoria more holistically. Something that your child might be saying that is speaking specifically to the physical and biological aspects of their dysphoria is maybe something along the lines of, I hate my facial hair, or I hate my period, or I wish my body was more curvy, or I wish it wasn't as curvy. And the more emotional and psychological aspects of gender dysphoria can be something along the lines of the mental health specifics of dysphoria. You might hear someone say, I get anxious when I speak. My voice isn't what I would like it to be. It contributes to me getting misgendered. Or I get depressed when I see my reflection without clothes on. I can't even look at myself without clothes on. The more social, interpersonal aspect of gender dysphoria can sound like, I don't want to go to school. And maybe your kiddo is just outright refusing to go to school or skipping classes. Maybe they're not even saying this, but their behavior is actually hinting that there's something happening, And so for me, when I have a parent reach out to me and say, my kid doesn't want to go to school, I don't know why. Usually when I talk to the child and I listen, usually there's some bullying happening, or maybe they can't use the restroom that they need to use, or maybe the restroom is there, but it's across the campus and it's locked half the time. And so there's usually something going on that the behavior, young people, children are so good at being creative around getting their needs met. And so they do not always have the language, depending on their age, depending on their developmental stage, to express, the impact and what's needed. So as adults, as parents, and as providers, we have to learn how to listen between the lines. It's actually our responsibility to do that. And what I would say is the most common phrase to describe someone's dysphoria is, I just don't feel right. I just don't feel like getting out of bed today. I can't really describe it. Just a sense of being wrong. And so for me, reviewing just the past few slides, all the anti-trans legislation, the history of just so much trauma, cultural trauma that we have for trans kids and trans community, of course, it's going to be hard to get out of bed sometimes. And so, what I always do as a therapist is I really make space to humanize those experiences and then say, okay, so let's figure out what we can do to make it a little bit better. And so I encourage you all as parents, as adults, to really listen for the suffering and the pain. It's not always going to be specifically named as gender dysphoria. And so we have to practice a little bit of intuition around listening to our kids and the young people in our life. And so just a few notes here on gender dysphoria before I move on to how to actually concretely help your kid, young people in your life, is that, as I've shared, some people can actually meet criteria for gender dysphoria and also identify as trans or non-binary, but some people don't. There are a lot of folks who identify as trans or non-binary somewhere under the umbrella. But if I were to speak to them, they actually don't have too much dysphoria. They're perfectly happy the way they are. Their experience has a lot of euphoria, pride, and joy to it. They might not actually have too much discomfort around how their body is, how they present. When they're by themselves, it may be more of an issue with maybe bullying or experiencing harassment in the workplace or public settings. For folks who do experience gender dysphoria symptoms, some identify as trans or non-binary, some don't. And I would actually say that more and more young people that I work with are starting to distance themselves from identifying outwardly as trans or non-binary. And part of me feels like that makes sense. Part of me feels like, well, of course, when you're seeing this onslaught of anti-trans legislation, it's going to be a little scarier to wave a flag or wear a pin. And some of it may really just be personal preference and identity, that I'm not a trans boy or a trans girl. I'm just a girl or boy, and I happen to need trans-related medical care. And for some folks, they experience so much dysphoria that they do need medical care, regardless of their identity, trans, non-binary or not. Some folks really do need hormones and or surgeries, maybe multiple surgeries, to actually get to the place where they can feel okay and that they can actually experience life in all of life's complexity without that added burden and added weight of dysphoria. And so, as you may have noticed when looking at ways to listen for dysphoria, really hearing it, some of the behavioral things that can happen, like avoidance, a lot of those symptoms and expressions have a lot of overlap with depression, anxiety, eating disorders, PTSD, and even substance use. And so there's a lot of, what's the word? A lot of competing priorities when it comes to multiple things going on. I can share with you all that in my private practice, I work with about half trans youth and non-binary kids. And I'd say most of them are struggling with depression, anxiety, maybe even an eating disorder, maybe PTSD and substance use too. And so, as I've shared, kids are extremely creative and really good at trying to get what they need. And so if there's discomfort in the body and they're not able to access medical care, whether that's hormones or surgeries, then they're going to try to control and manipulate their body in different ways, in the ways that they can. And so there's really high rates of disordered eating. For trans boys, there tends to be high rates of anorexia and restricted eating, really trying to prevent breast development, chest development, hips from widening. For trans girls, it may look like maybe substance use because the body is developing through puberty, and it's so unbearable that the young person may need to actually use substances to dissociate from certain parts of their puberty experience. And so we really see how for some, not all, for some young kids, they really are trying with what they have access to. And so at that point, that's when I invite parents and families into the conversation around, well, what can we actually consider so that they can be a little bit more comfortable in their body and go from there. And so I do need to talk about suicide. I know it's extremely heavy and it's always heavy on my heart. But when it comes to trans youth and kids, as I'm sure some of you are aware and have personally experienced, there's high risk for suicide. There was actually a recent study that trans youth I think it was somewhere around the lines, I have to look it up again, but I think it was somewhere along the lines of about uh, 1 in 4. So that's what, 25% of trans youth over the last year actually made an attempt. So I'll have to double check that, but that's an alarmingly high rate. And so for me, I really want to name that inherently being trans or non-binary is not itself a risk factor for suicide. Being trans doesn't mean inherently anything. It's just an identity, it's just an experience. But the risk factors for suicide often come with the social and cultural biases against trans people, and also unmanaged gender dysphoria when young people are not able to get what they need. And so other risk factors for suicide include their own internal conflict around their gender identity. When I work with young people, I often hear that they don't feel like they can actually share some of the conflict they have with their parents or family members because they're afraid that if they do, their parents will sort of take it an extra few steps and say like, well, you're not sure. I'm not going to let you start hormones or have surgery. And so that's where having a therapy space is really helpful. It's actually pretty normal to have some conflict and maybe even hesitation around life plans, major life decisions like medical transition. But what I listen for around the internal conflict is it actually shame and guilt that's been internalized from whether it's the family, the community, other adults, this country. And so really helping your kid sort of do like a tracing exercise where if you do have that relationship with your kiddo, where your kiddo is saying like, well, I don't know if it's worth it being trans. I don't know if I can handle it. Then really sort of tracing back that thought, where did you first have that thought? Where did you first hear that thought? Like, was it through the radio? Was it through social media, another adult? And I'd say 9 times out of 10, it's usually an external source. Is usually some sort of cultural or environmental uh, discriminatory belief and value that the young person then internalizes. So identifying that helps create separation. Other risk factors include, again, internal conflict. Low family connectedness is basically a social worky term for saying that the family is sort of in multiple pieces. It could be multi-home, multi-parent pairings. Maybe there's been separation due to legal issues, or maybe one parent has been imprisoned. And so when there's a disruption in the family, that is unfortunately a risk for suicide because it also makes it more challenging for the kid to know who they can go to. And unfortunately, sometimes kids are sort of put in the middle between parents or adults that are having conflict. And I would say that the biggest risk factor is family rejection. And so family rejection in translation would be the parents saying, no, can't do that. And oftentimes kids are listening for signs of rejection. They most likely already know, and they're listening, whether it's at the dinner table, the TV shows, the news that are being watched, comments on the radio, around what is the likelihood that my parent or my adult in my life is going to reject me if I come out to them, if I disclose. And so some kids that I work with, they only disclose maybe certain parts of who they are, certain identities, and not so much the rest. And it's sort of like an assessment of the home and the family. How much can I risk? How much can I keep to myself without fear of being rejected or having my phone taken away or some kind of punishment? And so family rejection is the biggest risk factor for suicide, which is why I'm super happy to be giving these talks. I want to give major props to the parents that are attending and the providers that work with parents and families, because even just one accepting, supportive parent has been shown to drastically decrease the risk for suicide. And so finally, going then to school and bullying, pre-COVID, now kind of somewhat back to pre-COVID life, but kids spend a lot of time at school. Nowadays, more and more in-person school returning to in-person. And so it's similar to the workplace. As adults, if you're working, if you're in an unhealthy, toxic work environment, probably gonna mess with your mental health, maybe the happiness of your marriage or family life. Same thing with kids. If it's an unsafe school environment, it's going to mess with their mental health, and bullying will really push them towards considering things that are more drastic. And so if you're a parent here, things to look out for as warning signs for mental health that's starting to struggle, possible risks for suicide, is that there's starting to be some significant noticeable changes around eating or sleeping. Usually that's actually insinuating, sort of implying that there's a chemical issue going on. The appetite might be being suppressed because depression is going up. Maybe anxiety is really high, so that sleeping, the body cannot actually rest enough to sleep. And so noticing if there's any significant changes around eating or sleeping, if there's any significant withdrawal either. And there's sort of a fine line between typical adolescent teenage angst and needing some independence and space, but really looking at withdrawal, where if it's not a chosen withdrawal to do something they enjoy, like, make art, listen to music, hang out with friends, that's all great, to a certain degree. That's all great around building independence and adult skills. But if it seems like it's more withdrawal, but there's a sense of loneliness and actually desiring relationships, but feeling like no one will accept them, or maybe no friend will stay in their life, will actually love them, that's more concerning. And then feelings are telling you, whether they're communicating to you or you're noticing it in their behavior, they're more agitated, maybe pacing more, grades are going down. And so the final that are a bit more sort of concrete, that I would say is more stereotypical too, is actually talking about ending their life, giving away prized possessions. And so when it gets to that point, that's when I would start kind of raising the red flag, like, okay, we need to actually start talking about, some more higher level interventions here. And so in the sidebar you see here, I put in sort of its own category. Self-harm behavior is actually not an immediate risk for suicide. The way that many mental health providers and primary care providers that we understand self-harm is that it's a coping mechanism. Basically, when self-harm happens, there's a bunch of chemicals that release in your body. So you kind of have this nice, not nice, but you have this sort of feeling of nice, uplifting emotion. And it takes you away from the really hard feelings that you're having in the moment. And so the challenge with self-harm is that once someone does self-harm, they're more at risk for continuing to self-harm because it becomes part of their toolkit in some ways to manage stress and to manage hard situations, hard feelings. And so if you notice that, for example, your kiddo has a cut somewhere, a burn somewhere, maybe they punched themselves, you saw them punch themselves, then I would pump the brakes and be like, okay, I know that you're having some hard feelings right now, and let's find an alternative. Instead of cutting yourself where you can accidentally cut yourself too deep or hurt yourself in a way that actually endangers your life, let's talk about some alternatives. And so, for example, when I do work with kids that do self-harm or have a history of it, we talk about safer alternatives. A safer alternative to cutting can be, using an ice cube. For people that are artistic, they actually like drawing on themselves with markers and pens. And so really encouraging sort of a replacement of the behavior, and to the point where over time, that behavior sort of loses its appeal. And then, it's not so much a attractive, shiny tool in the toolbox anymore. And so seeing self-harm is not an immediate sign that they need to go to the ER. It can be, but it needs follow-up conversation. Was there actually an intention to end life, or was it more you were really stressed? Did you get into an argument with a friend? Did you get into an argument with one of your parents? You got so upset that you just, did something kind of without thinking about it. Okay, that's not ideal, but it's better than sort of having that thought float around and continue to worsen. And so I'm gonna take a quick pause after this one, but some concrete examples for parents and providers, mostly parents, because providers, we've already been trained, but for parents, around responding to warning signs to suicide is sometimes there's a natural sort of hesitancy around asking about suicide. I really encourage you to be direct. The first step is to ask the question because you need a direct answer. And so if your kid is obviously in emotional pain, just ask them, are you thinking about killing yourself? And that's very black and white. It's going to be yes, no, I don't know. Well, what are you thinking about? And if your child does say yes, then listen to the reasons why they're even considering such a drastic option. And so I always recommend and I always include that when you are listening to your kid in a moment where they're feeling suicidal, there's usually a lot of really good reasons. It could be that school really sucks, could be that they can't see their friends, maybe parents are arguing, maybe they haven't found a job or something. There's usually many, many good reasons. And one of the natural responses that some people have, especially as parents, is to say, well, what about this? And well, we can do this, and kind of trying to make the situation better. That doesn't always help. That can actually feel pretty dismissive. And so again, your kids best, but what I would recommend is to initially err on the side of listening without judgment and listening without offering alternatives. You really just want to say, that sounds really hard. That I can tell that you're hurting right now. And so the main focus at the time is to really validate the feeling, make space for it, and start focusing on how to keep them safe. So then let's say your child says, yes, I have been thinking about ending my life because school is ending. I'm not going to see my friends. Summer really sucks. I can't see anyone. I'm just stuck at home. I don't like being home. There's no point anymore. You kind of see how the thought process continues until it gets to the point, well, what's the point of being here? And so then you would ask, have you thought about how you would do it? And I would say that most of the time, the young people I work with today, most of the time they haven't. It's more of a general feeling of hopelessness, a general feeling of just not being able to forecast into the future. And so if that's the case, we can work with that. We can actually say, okay, I know things feel really bad right now, but it can actually get better. And so what can we do right now? Does that mean calling a friend, watching a funny movie, listening to a song, going for a walk, doing something in the moment to kind of get them out of that space of hopelessness after you've provided some emotional support. And if your kid actually says, yes, I thought about doing XYZ, then you got to kind of pump in the gear and make sure that they can't actually follow through with XYZ and connect them with emergency services. So when there is that plan, there is that intention, then you do need to bring in professional help, because at that point, you do need some support, and that's okay. I really like giving concrete steps like this because it can feel overwhelming when there's a hard situation. But there are things that you as parents can do when there is an emergency, an emotional emergency. You can take them to urgent care. They may not be happy about it, but that may be actually what they need. And so after the incident, whether it resulted in going to the ER or calling suicide hotline or just cuddling up in bed, eating ice cream, watching a movie, check in with them again. That way they know that you care, and ask if there's anything else that can be done. And so before I go into a pause here for questions, I really like this infographic, because one of the privileges I've had over the many years of working with trans and non-binary folks is that I have been able to work with folks for years. And so I've had the honor and privilege of being alongside many people's healing journey and their recovery and in their process of self-affirmation and actualization. And so working with kids, one of the most common things I hear from parents, and one of the common sentiments I get from parents, is that after an emergency, there's this hope that it doesn't happen again, because there's so much energy, time, and money that goes into dealing with emergencies. and that can be like paying for residential, paying for partial hospitalization, IOP, therapy. It's also a huge trauma for the parents and the family as well. And so, of course, there's this hope that it never happens again. But what I like about this infographic is that the reality of suicidality is that it tends to be different for everyone. And that also means that it tends to be either in waves or have episodes. And so for the y-axis, kind of top to bottom here, you have sort of starting from kind of low risk, which is no suicidal thoughts, to more passive, like I don't really want to be here anymore, kind of more like just feelings of hopelessness, up to starting having a plan, all the way to the having an intention and follow through with the plan and the attempt. And so moving across the x axis, kind of left to right, you kind of see how, this is just kind of imaginary here, but this is actually what I've seen in my practice and in my work, where for some folks, they may have a period of their life where they're making many, many, many attempts, and then maybe it completely goes away as they get older and they get what they actually need. Some folks have a sort of chronic feeling of not wanting to be here in the blue here, but no attempt, but kind of chronic throughout their life. And that's when we start looking at, chronic persistent depression, chronic dysphoria. And, you have other folks who are maybe constantly at high risk and need some level of higher care. And so when we're talking about kids, they haven't had that many years of life yet so that we actually know what their mental health history can look like. And so the hope is that by parents getting involved, professionals and adults getting involved, including teachers, other adults in their life that they support and look up to, hopefully when there is a crisis, they'll then have enough skills and they know enough about themselves, the family has learned enough to actually respond effectively, that there won't be another episode or another attempt, or if there is one, it'll be less severe. And so as for the parents in the room, I just encourage you to make space and meet your kiddo where they're at, and also know that part of recovery includes relapse, and that can look like relapse into self-harm or disordered eating or a depressive episode, and that's part of recovery. The hope is that as long as we're making little steps in the right direction, then that's a good thing. It's not always going to be linear. And so I'm going to take a quick pause because I think we have about 30 minutes left. And so I wanted to take some questions. So I'm just going to take a look at the chat here.
Do you want me to read them out, Lotus, or do you have it?
I think I got it.
Okay, cool.
Thank you, though.
Sure.
So first question I see, how can parents understand if anxiety or depression is not just typical teen angst, or if it's actually gender dysphoria? So that is a great question. Thank you. And so let's see. Okay. So that's the first part of the question. And I really love this question because, trans kids, non-binary kids also deserve to have teen angst as part of their normal development. What I often see with families is that when something happens, if someone's not, if the young person is not in a good mood or needs some alone time, it's sometimes sort of pigeonholed into their gender identity is because of their dysphoria. And sometimes it is, but not always. And so what I would say is that there's a certain acceptable level of teen angst that I think parents, we can all sort of expect from our kids. If you're a trans kid or non-binary kid happens to be the oldest, then maybe there isn't as much of that sort of comparison that you can have with other kids, your other kids. So I would say that in terms of gender dysphoria, to really listen for, let's say an example is, one of the examples I see is that some of the trans kids I work with, they wear like really big hoodies and they might wear a hoodie even if it's really hot outside, and maybe their hair covers their face a lot. And part of that can be sort of that teenage angsty emo kind of gothic stage of their life. And the other part of that, it can also fulfill sort of gender euphoria for them, where they don't have to really show their curves. They're sort of having this androgynous appearance. Hopefully they don't get misgendered. They're hiding their face. A lot of kids really like wearing the mask because of COVID, because it hides a part of their face they feel is gendered. And so, I'm always a big fan of, if your kiddo, if you noticed, is isolating more, not wanting to go to social events or family gatherings, part of that could be typical teenage stuff. But you can also ask, like, hey, do you not want to go to this dinner? Is there anyone there that makes you uncomfortable? Like, is there anything we can do that will help you feel more comfortable in going? And if it's just like a no, I just don't want to go, it might be a teen thing, but you actually might find that maybe your kid doesn't feel comfortable around someone, or is afraid that someone might misgender them in a certain space. And so the other question, I think, as a follow-up here is, many parents, myself included, before I learned more, feel our kids should heal from having depression before going forward with transition. Can you say more about the importance of recognizing depression as a main symptom of gender dysphoria, and how taking steps towards gender affirmation can actually reduce and even eliminate some of these symptoms? And so I absolutely love that. Thank you for bringing that up. And you're completely right, is that, as you've shared, many parents feel that there's a need to completely resolve and heal from depression, anxiety, even trauma, childhood trauma, abuse, before pursuing any gender affirmation, especially medical. And what we actually find is that they don't have to happen independently. In fact, most of the time when gender dysphoria is actually included into the plan, the treatment plan, the healing process, we actually see that everything else starts getting better too. I can share that one of the privileges I've had is working with adults all the way up to 80 years old, and children as young as 12. And so really seeing across the lifespan how gender dysphoria can change, and how not having access to gender affirmation, gender affirming care can actually prolong struggle and suffering. So I've worked with some families where access to, let's say, for example, gender affirming chest surgery for trans boys or non-binary kids that want and need chest surgery, sometimes after that, the eating disorder completely goes away. I'd say in the more rare cases, it may still be there. And that's a real consideration as well. But we have to sort of weigh the possible risk and the possible benefit. And I would say that usually the potential benefit greatly outweighs the risk. And so the last question I see here before I move on is, keeping connections affirming and respectful, will you provide some examples of how to ask a person what pronouns they identify or prefer? Thank you. Great question. And so something that you all might be aware of is California actually passed a bill in the last couple of years where government agencies need to collect data on gender identity and sexual orientation. And so, as you can imagine, figuring out ways to respectfully ask someone for their pronouns or how they identify has been a hot topic. And I think the government is still figuring out best practices. But what I would recommend is that, let's say it's a non-professional setting where it's a family gathering, a work gathering. I just did this morning. I was talking with someone at the cafe in my neighborhood while I was walking my dog, and they said, "Oh, my name's so-and-so." And I said, "Oh, my name's Lotus." And I actually said, I use he, him pronouns. What are your pronouns? And so for me, I try to have it be casual, and I often self-disclose first to sort of show that it's actually a culture that we're trying to normalize and that we don't want the weight and the burden of pronoun disclosure to be only on trans and non-binary people. This is actually a great way for non-trans people to be allies. Is that if you're in a workplace, you can add pronouns to your email signature, for example, or you can be the person that suggests to do it during all staff meetings, or things like that. So I would just say you can always introduce yourself first and your pronouns, and then say, what are yours? And if there's sort of a confusion around it, say, oh, well, I just want to make sure that I'm respectful and not make any assumptions. And so it could be he, him, she, her, they, them. And usually, over time, I've found that more and more people are aware of what pronouns are, thanks to so much advocacy and more education. And so again, you can always model by disclosing your own pronouns and name, asking, and if follow-up is needed, you can sort of just give a quick explanation. Oh, I just want to make sure that I'm respectful. It doesn't have to be a big deal. I would say that definitely only on one hand have I received sort of a negative backlash from a stranger on the street where I would ask for pronouns, where maybe it would be, well, can't you see that I'm, oh, well, okay, I don't want to make an assumption. And I just, honestly, I don't pay it. I just pay it. I don't pay it any mind. But most of the times the reaction's a genuine appreciation for respect. So that would be my recommendation. And so I want to make sure we finish on time here. And so for the parents that are attending, professionals and adults, I want to share some of the ways that you can consider actually consider for your kiddo and the young people in your life. The truth is that they don't need to suffer, and that there are medical options for them if that's something that they need. And so really, really super quick sort of overview is that before the 2000s and mid 1900s, pretty much gender non-conformity, transgender experience was considered a disorder. It's a diagnosis, and over time, through advocacy and more education, both from family members, community members, providers, nowadays the general best practice that's recommended is called gender affirming care model. And so the core principles and values of gender affirming care, and we're talking about medical care here, clinical care, even in all settings really, is that, gender variation is not a disorder. Gender nonconformity, whether it's a boy wearing a dress, someone wanting to do their hair a certain way, maybe pursuing a certain career that they're not supposed to, quote unquote supposed to, is not inherently a disorder. Gender presentation, basically clothes that's being worn, hairstyles, things like that, is actually naturally diverse and has been varied across cultures forever. And so I can share, I'm someone who's Vietnamese, and I'm first generation Vietnamese. And so in my culture, what's transgender gets translated to Doing Yai, but it's actually not a literal translation. Doing Yai, I would say more accurately, is translated to, shifting, transforming your worldly being. And so there's actually not so much a specific emphasis on gender until more recently, because it's being translated as transgender. And so there's a sense of a spiritual transformation that happens. And so I give that as an example because depending on your culture, where you were raised, your community, your racial, ethnic background, there's probably some cultural diversity around gender and sexuality as well. Gender is also not always binary. It can be fluid. And as others have pointed out, if there's other mental health challenges going on, it's often secondary. In other words, it's often fueled by gender dysphoria and the cultural biases and violence against trans people. It's often not, the primary issue. And so when we're looking at eating disorders, depression, anxiety, trauma, it's actually often secondary. And then I would say, out of the hundreds of folks that I've worked with, then usually a smaller portion subset of that, then even after their gender affirmation, they've completed their surgeries, everything that they've needed to treat their dysphoria, then there may still be other issues, and that's completely normal. But oftentimes the issues then become less severe and there's more space to actually work with them. And so I'm going to move a little bit quicker. And so I'm going to go through just various treatment options here for parents to consider for their kiddos. When it comes to gender affirmation, gender transition, non-medical options are actually usually the first step for all ages. And so, someone I see here ask about puberty blockers. And so for kiddos that have not reached puberty or are in the early stages of puberty, for children that have not reached any puberty, there's no medical interventions because there's nothing to really intervene with, if that makes sense. For kids who are early stages of puberty, that's when we start considering puberty blockers. And so, someone in the chat asked, what are my thoughts on puberty blockers? My short answer would be they are life-saving if they're the right treatment. And so in terms of research, there's research that, I would say generally agrees that long-term use of puberty blockers has very minimal side effects, if any. And basically a really short summary of how puberty blockers work is that they send a signal to your brain that says, stop the puberty, stop it from happening. And so puberty stops. It basically is a giant pause button. And one of the great things about puberty blockers is that it's not permanent. And so my thoughts for puberty blockers is that if there is a young person, a kiddo who is like, I do not want to go through puberty because I know what's going to happen. I see the other kids going through puberty. That seems terrible. I'm going to hate myself. I might hurt myself. Might be worth considering puberty blockers. I would also say that puberty blockers are controversial. And, I like to give a whole answer and be honest. And they're controversial because access to puberty blockers to treat gender dysphoria in children is relatively new. I would say that when I first started working, it was before the Affordable Care Act. Children, minors were still not able to access gender affirming care through insurance, definitely not puberty blockers. And so puberty blockers through insurance is a relatively recent occurrence. And because of that, there's not enough research to confidently say that it is safe. Now, the research that is around puberty blockers is on puberty blockers for precocious puberty, which is a kiddo who may or may not be trans, usually back then wasn't trans, who goes through puberty at like 9, maybe 8, way too young to be appropriate. And so puberty blockers are used. So we have research on that. We have research on puberty blockers being used for precocious puberty, but not so much on gender dysphoria treatment. And so, what I would say is that the whole answer is that it's controversial, but in my experience working with kids who do want puberty and are able to access it is completely life-saving because they don't then have to try to reverse, which is often not reversible, the changes that happen with puberty, whether that's chest development, facial hair, height, so many things happen on puberty that are gendered. And so for trans and non-binary kids that are able to access puberty blockers, that can save them, a lifetime of possibly not having to go through surgery, and actually focusing on other things. There is emerging research that's coming out that kids that are able to access puberty blockers for treatment of gender dysphoria actually end up having comparable lives to non-trans kids, which is pretty great. That's the goal, in my opinion. And so coming back to my slides here, for folks of all ages, non-medical gender transition is a great way to actually improve the quality of life. That can be social and legal changes like name change, pronoun change, getting the clothes that feels good for you, getting the haircut that feels good for you, and using the right name and pronouns really, really matters. It's not a silly thing. It's not a joke. It's actually been shown to reduce depression, including suicidal ideation in youth. And so Jill here put a great resource, genderhq.org, which gives more information on puberty blockers. Thank you. And so this is a great table that I like around various ways that you can actually talk with your kid around what is possible right now. What can we actually do? And what is the, what's the word? What is the plan? And so I like to talk about it where some things are not a no, it's just a not yet. And so usually families and parents are comfortable with non-permanent reversible things. That could be like hairstyle, clothing, maybe using the affirm name and pronouns, updating it at school, updating it among family members at the next gathering, or maybe before the next gathering so that there's preparation. And so, I would always say that there are things that can happen relatively quickly to help your kid feel affirmed and safer and seen and validated and heard. That can look like social transition things, working on legal transition things as well. And then if it's getting to the point where puberty is happening, there's more and more discomfort around the body, then I would say considering a referral to a doctor that specializes in gender-related care to consider whether or not puberty blockers are the right treatment for your kid. Other reversible treatment options can actually be menstrual suppression as well. That's not included in here. That's a great way for kids to not get that monthly regular reminder of their biology if that's causing them stress and hormonal issues. And they can actually suppress it temporarily until they get on hormones if that's what they'd like. So then we see the medical aspects here where it does legally require parental involvement to make sure that as a family, you understand the possible risks, benefits, the possible alternatives. That's when we start looking at hormone therapy, surgeries, things that involve a mental health provider like myself and a doctor. And so for kids that have reached puberty or even completed puberty, then you can start looking at medical options. For kids that are in the early stages of puberty, like we discussed, puberty blockers may actually decrease or prevent the need for surgeries later in life, as well as decrease overall symptoms of gender dysphoria. I've had the privilege of working with young teenagers, young adults who were able to access puberty blockers, and I am honestly amazed. Just the level of confidence, the level of ambition and ability to dream and forecast into the future. It honestly amazes me sometimes. And it's what I hope for in terms of the next generation of trans and non-binary kids, is that they actually do get a plan for the future. It's not just trying to get by and waiting for the next surgery or access to hormones. And so again, like I said, we've had research that's confirming that access to puberty blockers significantly lowers suicidal ideation. If your kiddo did not become aware or disclose of their gender identity and need for medical services until after puberty, maybe they're like 16, 17, 18, or if they were like me, 26 before they realized what they needed, then puberty blockers aren't going to do anything. At that point, you start talking about hormones, you start considering surgery as well. And so when it comes to surgery, I'm not going to dive into it because that is literally a 2-hour talk. But basically, surgeries, when they're medically necessary, when they're needed to treat gender dysphoria, there's all other options have been exhausted. They can actually reduce and oftentimes completely eliminate other challenges, mental health challenges. That's when we start seeing depression go down, anxiety go down. I've seen really severe cases of disordered eating completely go away after top surgeries. I've also seen where someone who's completely isolated doesn't go out, doesn't go to groups, social groups, events, family events. Once they're able to actually get onto medical hormones and surgery, they then have a very fulfilling life and they're, social butterflies. And so access to surgeries can definitely save lives. And because surgeries range in complexity and also insurance requirements, because we have a very, unfortunately, complicated health system in the United States, I really recommend that if your kiddo is asking for or seeking gender affirming surgery, to consult with a specialist. I'm going to share some resources around local gender surgery specialty clinics. And also, please feel free to contact me. I'm happy to be a resource for you all. And so finally, what parents, general adults can do is, these are just some bullet points, takeaways, is that the main thing, especially if you do have a trans kid, non-binary kid, is that we have to focus on what we do have control over. And so right now, what is outside of our control is a lot of these legislations and political issues. I mean, we can call, we can sign petitions, but your kid is going to see these things and it's the outside environment. So what you do have control over is your home environment. And so fostering a supportive home, you can be the safe person that your kid talks to. You can be the space where if the kid isn't experiencing it anywhere else, that at least you're using the right name and the right pronouns. You're letting your kid wear the clothes that they want to, even if they can't do it at school or out in public. And so if the school is not a safe place, no matter how much you've advocated and pushed for change, then you might need to look at alternatives. I've had families in my work with them actually end up pulling their kids out of school and do homeschool, because sometimes it ends up being so just toxic at school and the kid was really at risk that sometimes you have to look at alternatives. And so it never hurts to express direct support for your kid. Even if your kid doesn't identify as trans or non-binary, their experience is still unique. And so understanding that, you can still validate their gender identity and express support that they are not experiencing the world in the same ways as non-trans kids. They're having additional things to consider and it's more nuanced than that. You can promote and definitely enforce respect. What I hear a lot about is many kids started disclosing their gender identity during the pandemic and during the initial shelter in place because they were at home more. Maybe they were out at school, but not at home. But now that they were home all the time, hearing the name that was not their chosen name, or hearing the pronouns that misgender them by their parents or siblings or family members, it started adding up too much and was intolerable. And so they ended up disclosing their gender during the shelter in place. And so I would say that now that things are slowly opening up again, you may be traveling, you may be seeing family, maybe you have some vacation plans this summer, really having that conversation with your kid. If you are going to see family members soon, have a vacation, do you want me to tell, auntie, grandparent, whatever, about your gender identity or pronouns? And if so, do you want me to do it before? Do you want me to do it then? Do you want to be there? But talking it out, and hopefully you can be the advocate for your kid in the family system as well, offering education and resources, including to family members. You can really also try to focus on gender affirmation as well. Dysphoria, it can be a huge, completely overwhelming experience and aspect of a trans and non-binary kid's life. And so trying to offset some of that with figuring out, what can you actually experience? What can your kid experience during the day or during the week where they feel really affirmed in their gender and they experience some of that joy and gender euphoria? Honestly, when I work with kids, a lot of the work I do is creative. We talk about anime, manga, movies, we talk about books, and we look at characters to see which one of these characters actually feel like they're the gender that you want to, embody and present in the world. And how can you change a little bit, maybe tweak your hair a little bit, ask your parents to get you certain clothes, certain hobbies you can do, so you actually feel really good. And so trying to offset some of the many layers of dysphoria with as much gender euphoria as possible will help your kids' overall mental health. And so finally here, we're wrapping up, and it looks like we'll wrap up right on time. This is sort of preaching to the choir, but why support for trans kids matter. There's been a research study that shows that having even just one supportive parent can double life satisfaction, almost triple, significantly higher self-esteem, significantly higher mental health. And as you know, can also reduce depression and significantly reduce attempted suicide. Sorry for that picture. I shouldn't have put that there. But, and so I'm going to end here with some final resources. I see some folks putting in resources. Thank you so much. And yes, and so again, let me just do a quick review of these resources in case folks aren't aware. The Trans Lifeline is a great resource that's buying for trans and non-binary folks. If your kiddo is having a hard time, give them that phone number. They can call someone that's part of the community as a peer counselor just to talk. There's very low obligations. You really can just call and get some emotional support, especially if they're having a hard time. Someone also shared about Gender Spectrum, great organization that focuses on families, adults with gender expansive kids in their life. They have a great conference that I've been to, and it's honestly amazing to see so many happy, thriving trans and non-binary kids with supportive parents. And then the parents often become friends with each other. The kids become friends with each other. It's great. And so Gender Spectrum also has a lot of great resources as well online. That's their website there. I also put the Sparrow Center. We have someone here that I saw. So thank you for joining. And they're a local organization specifically for Marin County LGBTQ and HIV pause community. And so that's their contact information. Check out their website for resources. And I also want to highlight here for folks who maybe wanting to connect with other parents specifically, there's PFLAG, there's various chapters. I put in the LA chapter there, but there's definitely a Bay Area chapter. There's a lot of parent specific resources on their website. The Trevor Project is actually one of my favorite organizations because they've really developed over the years. Now they actually have a 24/7 chat-based, which is like online web chat-based. They also have a text-based chat line for counselors and a phone-based. So that they've really taken the feedback, from young people. And so a lot of the young people that I work with, they're not really comfortable being on the phone. And maybe they don't have access to a laptop, but they might have a phone. And so when they're having a hard time, you really can just text the Trevor Project and then they'll connect you with a counselor. And so great resource, especially for young LGBTQ folks. And then especially in the Bay Area here, if you're interested in gender affirming surgeries, I actually used to be the clinical director for Gender Health SF. And so this organization is specifically for San Francisco residents, but they will offer education and overall resources around maybe what your kid who's becoming an adult, or maybe your kid is 18, 19, really wanting to pursue surgery. They'll have resources around how to access surgery as well. Okay, and so I'm going to, look at the comments here. We do have time for questions. And so I'm just going to take a quick look here. Okay, give me one moment. All right, so I do see a comment here from a parent. Please, I do also recommend, I didn't include here, but UCSF is a great organization as well. They have a lot of resources online for gender affirming care. And all right. And so again, I do see a discussion happening around puberty blockers. And like I shared, it's controversial, but I can only speak from my experience. And my experience is that for young people that are able to access puberty blockers, it's been amazing to witness them grow and be able to really live fulfilling lives without the added burden of gender dysphoria. And so again, puberty blockers are definitely controversial, and you can sort of find the whole spectrum if you were to just blink Google puberty blockers. But I do recommend looking at UCSF, for example, and other gender specialty clinics, because a lot of the work that we do directly with families is ahead of research. We're doing it real time, and research tends to happen a few years later. And so any questions, any comments at all. I'm gonna, just want to thank you all again for staying with me. I know this was a pretty ambitious slide deck and presentation, but again, just thank you so much for spending this evening with me. And I left my email here. Please keep in touch. I'm happy to be a resource for you and your families. And there's my website. I recommend looking at the resource tab because the resources, I've included many resources that I've shared with the young people that I work with too, including YouTube videos that, kind of coach them on maybe deepening their voice or feminizing their voice, things like that. And so take a look at the resource page and I'll stick around for more questions. Thank you again, everyone. And thank you, Shireen, so much for hosting me.